Okay, let's go ahead.
Yes, so just to preface my question very quickly. I've been a graduate student for almost 5 years, so I'm not sure how much relevance this is going to have in the real world. But I can tell you a little bit about positions on campus politics. And this discussion seems to have been about the tensions between liberalism and Zionism. And I think something that's lurking in the background that hasn't been discussed is the anti-liberal left and its power on campus. So the polls that were cited, I assume, were for Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. In my experience, Palestinians in the diaspora tend to be much more radical, much more anti-liberal leftist than Palestinians within the territories or within Israel. And particularly professors, I'm thinking about people like Stephen Saleta, Rashid Khalidi. I don't know how anti-liberal he is, but from what I've read, he seems anti-liberal. Nadia Al-Haj, various other people.
Remember the time.
Yes.
Bring it to a question. That would be
yeah.
great.
And what do we do about this sort of reflexive anti-liberal, anti-colonialism in which, you know, it was mentioned that we can all agree that certain other Middle Eastern states are worse than Israel, but among this sort, that is not necessarily the case because the initial colonial nature of Israel makes it fundamentally, almost on a metaphysical level, worse than anything else. And what do you do about the sort of discursive power these people have on campus?
On the first one, I would just say, I think it is a tendency of the left to see colonialism, imperialism as the gravest of all sins politically. And I think it's not the greatest of all sins. It is a very grave sin, but I think it is. Without speaking about any particular people, I do think that it's important to recognize. The left does have historically has a tendency, I think, to find it hard sometimes to get really worked up about things that post-colonial regimes do to their own people, and I think that's been a blind spot of the left.
I wanted to respond to you.
Rob?
To Rob's point, your observation about how the discourse has shifted among Palestinian American scholars in this case, and particularly among Palestinian solidarity activists, so-called, let's just use lumps here, is true in that they use the discourse of Israel being a colonialist regime. Now, I have a response to that, and I'll say it very briefly, but then I want to say something about the response, and that is the traditional idea of colonialism was core periphery, where the Western powers were coming and exploiting local resources and sending them back to the host country. Zionism was very much an inversion of that. It was the idea of collective rehabilitation of the Jewish nation, so much so that instead of exploiting Palestinian labor, you had this ethic of Hebrew labor, avodah ivrit, which is why Saeed Kashua's sitcom is a play on that called avodah alavit, Arab labor, which is also slang for shoddy work, so it's the idea of racism being put under the microscope. Whatever it is, it was a classic colonialism. However, in the process, local Palestinian farmers lost their livelihood. So though they weren't being exploited, they were being marginalized, which was also a form of economic violence, maybe sin of omission rather than commission. But the point is, I have a response to that, or I could get, you might already have thought of that, and you could tell them that. But then the question is, so what? Each side has their talking points, and how are we going to get past this? So what I prefer to see is they are saying, this hurts me, this hurts, there's something wrong, whether it's the use of the A word, the apartheid word, which again is an imperfect analogy, but it's a term to point to something being terribly wrong. How are we, everyone, going to fix what's wrong?
Let me take three more again. And
I wanted to ask Anthony to expand on something, and then the other panelists comment on it. And what I'd like to hear more about is this idea about liberal Zionism being a barrier to a just resolution.
But I think the question that you just asked, I think, is a really important one. I don't believe that liberal Zionism is a barrier to the solution. I think that what happens, at least in the American Jewish context, is that there are real liberal Zionists and there are fake liberal Zionists, which is to essentially say there is a large industry in the American Jewish establishment of people who claim they support the two-state solution. but in fact have never done, that only pursue policies that actually destroy the two-state solution, right? So though I don't consider those people real liberal Zionists, I consider them fake liberal Zionists. I think that basically they will never fundamentally criticize or challenge the Israeli government, no matter what it does, in terms of destroying the two-state solution. You didn't hear any major American Jewish organization that ostensibly supports two states say anything this week when there was new evidence that actually of what most, I think, serious people already know, which is that Benjamin Netanyahu has no interest in the two-state solution. He occupies a political party that is massively hostile to it, right? But that, it seems to me, is different from people who are genuine liberal Zionists. I mean, we have our own flaws. We can be criticized in lots of ways. But I think to suggest that we are a barrier, that we oppose pressure, is wrong. We may not support all of the same pressure as people to our left. Speaking for myself, I do not support the BDS movement, but I do support boycotting the settlements in conjunction with an affirmation of Israel's right to exist. I support Palestinian bids at the UN. I support America not allowing our federal money to be spent across the Green Line, and there are several other options. So I think that's part of what's behind this idea that liberal Zionists are a barrier to, but I think that liberal Zionists are better seen as one of several groups who want pressure on Israel. Our means are different because our goals are different. But I think to see liberal Zionists as simply people who who in the end of the day always end up supporting the status quo, I think is just not correct with the liberal Zionists that I think of as authentic liberal Zionists.
So let me add that. I see it as different from that, because to me, when I say liberal Zionism is a barrier to just resolution, it's because of this notion, which I also referred to at the end of my remarks, that the existence of liberal Zionism, the existence of liberal organizations, tends to give this idea that there is something today called Zionist ideology, which is a live thing which we talk about and has real meaning in terms of what is going on in Israel. And the point I've made is that I would say this again, is that there is really only one active Zionism that has any agency, and that's the one which is being led in Israel by the messianic ethno-nationalists, the extreme religious. So what liberal Zionism does is it gives this notion that there's something to talk about, that the real issue about Israel and Israel-Palestine for us in the Jewish community and Zionists is to talk about Zionism and to oppose that Zionism and to put forward this Zionism. When, in my view, that's not what the conflict is about now. The conflict is a political conflict now with religious overtones or undertones, and that's the way it has to be seen. It's a problem fundamentally. It's a problem for the Israeli state, for Israeli politicians from the particularly the Israeli Jewish side. They've got to deal with this. This is something that they have to deal with. And my view is actually, Israeli is actually. I get to talk about the liberal Zionism. There was some admittedly critical Israelis there, but they came out to me afterwards and they said, look, really, basically, we don't want. You diaspora Jews, you just keep out of it. Let us get on with this, right? Yes, help us by expressing your feelings, your views about certain things, but to come in with pressure all the time, as if you're conforming to some old-style Israel diaspora relationship, which existed once upon a time. That's no good, and I don't think that's good for Israel, because it allows Israel to and particularly the right in Israel, to turn to the diaspora for support for its politics. And of course, the right are very adept at that, and they've got people like Sheldon Adelson and so on behind them. And I think this is really a corruption of Israeli politics. It's a corruption of any good relationship between Jews outside of Israel and in Israel. So the point I'm making is that the existence of liberal Zionism puts this pattern on a politics which isn't about, really, it's not about an argument between Zionists anymore. I think that's really actually dead. It's about a politics which has to be faced up to by the people on the ground. And we've got to find some way of helping those people on the ground to reach a resolution, but not one which means us piling in with our kind of diaspora organizations. Sometimes they're mirror images of Israeli organizations, sometimes they're tied up financially and so on. So that's why I think it's a barrier.
Mr. Lerman, when I read your article in the New York Times, I also kind of thought it was pie in the sky, somewhat the way that Peter has spoken about it, but now that I hear you, I'm quite taken by it, and especially as you see the way that liberal Zionism can be a fig leaf and can mask then getting anything done within Israel. And that's really my question for all of you, because I actually think in many ways you all agree rather than disagree. It's just different approaches. And how then can the movement take place in Israel with a government that will probably be reelected, and where is that movement really going to come from? I think arguing about whether it's Zionism or liberal Zionism, whatever, is not necessarily the major issue. The issue is, how does change take place in Israel, and how can that really happen from the humanistic ideals that many of us here in this room, I think, really care about?
On the question of how will change happen, I guess I agree to a significant degree with Anthony. I mean, I think that change will happen when the price of Israeli control of the West Bank goes up. Right now, the price is low. It's low because of the security cooperation of the Palestinian Authority, and so Israel doesn't have to send its young, soldiers there to patrol every Palestinian city and town like it did before Oslo. It has the subcontractor in the West Bank, and it's low because Israel doesn't even really have to pay for it, because the Europeans and others basically pay for that subcontractor to do Israel's dirty work for it. So I think when that changes, then I think we enter a different reality in terms of the political discussion and what's politically possible. So I don't think what I would hope is that what I desperately hope is that the price goes up in a way that's nonviolent, right? And I think this is partly where I agree with Anthony, that there are mechanisms for making the price go up that are nonviolent, and that those of us who believe in the legitimacy of some kind of Jewish state can also be a part of. Even though we may in times be in coalitions with people who don't. But then also, and this is where I think that probably in reality the bottom up and the top down will meet, is that I would hope that you could create a political space in Washington and other centers of power, that when that dynamic changed, and when the Israeli government could not kind of coast along as it is now, and had to recognize the possibility of change, that at that point you could have a political infrastructure for an American president to actually be able to say, okay, you know what, now you're saying things can't continue, here's where I think we can go. And I'm going to be willing to do that, even though it's going to lead me into a big fight with the Shell Adelsons and all the people who take his money. So I think that there is an important role for diaspora Jews, especially American Jews, given America's relationship with Israel, but it is to be ready for that moment of change that starts on the ground, so then we can play a role in actually responding to it in a constructive way.
So.